thrilled to have Marco Oliveira. He is a professor, translator, and writer. He earned his PhD in comparative literature and master's in Romance languages and literatures from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his BA in religious studies from the University of South Carolina. He has taught several academic courses and written a number of scholarly articles on the topics of art, literature, and culture. His alter ego, Gringo Caracoa, is a poet and visual artist based in Rio de Janeiro, whose work has been published in books and journals and exhibited in galleries and museums both in Brazil and abroad. And we are thrilled about him coming to talk to us about the art of yoga and the yoga of art.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Linda. I would like to begin by thanking everyone here for being here today on Saturday, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening. I would also like to thank Ricky and the Neohumanist College for the invitation to speak about what for me is a very interesting and dear topic, which is the relations between art and yoga. I prepared a presentation for us today, and I'm excited to share it. And I will begin by sharing my screen, and I believe it is now being shared. So our topic today is the art of yoga and the yoga of art. You are seeing an image by an Argentine painter from almost 100 years ago, Shul Solar. And the title of the painting is Un Yogi, a yogi. And Shul Solar was a very famous avant-garde artist from the early 20th century, friends with his fellow Argentine writer, Jorge Luis Borges, who is much more famous. But we see that Shul Solar had a strong interest in spirituality, lots of different traditions, but we also see that he had at least some interest in yoga. So I chose to begin with this image. Forgive me for a second, but my screen froze. So I will change slides as soon as it catches up with me. I've divided this lecture into three parts. The first part is most closely related to the title, the art of yoga and the yoga of art. Basically, I'll be trying to show how we can think of yoga and we can think of art in analogous terms. So we will be discussing how both yoga and art can be seen as a practice of philosophy of science and an art or a yoga. We will then speak a little bit about the aims of art, and finally about the relationship between culture and pseudo-culture. So to begin, most people associate yoga with a practice. It's a very popular practice, particularly in the West. It has become increasingly popular, and generally people think of yoga as an exercise, right? Lots of different postures that are good for flexibility, strength, circulation, respiration, um, uh, relaxation, etc. Some people or most people also associate other practices such as meditation with these yoga postures, but a very select few also know that yoga is a complete system, right? A system of practices. So we have um, the term Ashtanga yoga, which means the yoga of 8 limbs, and these are a series of practices that were codified thousands of years ago, and they include, you know, morality and ethics in the yamas and niyamas, the yoga postures, which are called asanas, pranayama, breath control, pratyahara, withdrawal of senses, dharana, concentration, dhyana, which is meditation proper, And finally, the ultimate goal of yoga, samadhi, right? Absorption. Uh, so um, this is the practice of yoga. Um, Once we get into yoga as a complete system, we see that yoga is indeed a philosophy, right? And everything about yoga is philosophical. A simple symbol that is very well known, like the Om symbol, is full of significance. Every stroke, uh, every part of the symbol has a meaning, a very profound meaning, which I will not really get into, but um, uh, everything is philosophical about yoga. Even the name, Sanskrit, is an ancient language, uh, and it's a philosophical language. The word yoga in Sanskrit uh, basically has two uh, meanings. The general meaning is can mean either unity or addition, and a more profound meaning is the idea of unification. So when we talk about yoga as a let's say as a spiritual practice, right? We're thinking of yoga more in terms of unification. Um, Different important figures throughout history have sought to define yoga. The Ashtanga yoga to which I referred was codified by a philosopher named Patanjali. And in his Yoga Sutras, he gave two definitions for yoga. One is yoga means the suspension of all psychic propensities. Um, so, like psychic propensities meaning tendencies of the mind, right? Of thoughts, uh, desires, etc. And another definition: when the mind is free from any sort of thinking, the mind is completely free of thoughts. That state is called yoga. So this is Patanjali's definition. Um, the Another definition is found in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a very famous book. The Bhagavad Gita, a translation would be celestial song. It's part of the longer epic Mahabharata, uh, the longest epic actually um, in the history of humanity. And in the Bhagavad Gita, uh, yoga is defined as such. Yoga is skill in action, and the other definition, equanimity is yoga. So these are um, two definitions of yoga found in the Bhagavad Gita. Uh, it's this image that we see is Krishna speaking to Arjuna on the battlefield. The entire Bhagavad Gita is basically an allegory of um, it's a war between two parties, right? But it's an allegory of the struggle, the fight that we have, that each of us has in our minds and in the world around us. Um, Another definition of yoga, and this is uh, the one that we will focus more on, uh, is from the Shiva, who is considered the father of yoga, the founder of yoga. And this definition is the unification of the unit soul with the universal soul. That is yoga, right? So this idea of unification is prevalent in the idea of yoga, in the philosophical conceptualization of yoga. Um, we can also think of yoga as a science, right? Uh, we could term it, for instance, an intuitional science. Normally, when we think of science, in its strictest sense, we think of the exact sciences, the natural sciences, etc. We may get into the social sciences, and we can also think of the human sciences. But generally, in the West, we have certain conceptions of science, and in its broadest sense, science refers to a branch or study of knowledge, right? So any kind of systematic or systematized knowledge, um, uh, can be considered a science. Um, and we can also think of science as applied knowledge, right? Particularly when it involves skill or proficiency in that applied knowledge. So if we apply that idea to yoga, we can definitely see how yoga is a science uh, along those terms, right? And here we have many examples of science, and we could have, like I said, include yoga as a science when we think of it in this way. Um, and finally, we can think of yoga as an art, right? Um, this is a yantra. Uh, uh, the the official name is the Sri Yantra, but it's basically an artistic depiction of what yoga aims to do, right? And we can see just by looking at the image that it's perfect, right? Perfection, right? So this is an artistic representation of the path of yoga, we can say, the practice of yoga, the science of yoga, philosophy of yoga, everything all in one image, right? Um, so when we think of yoga as an art, right? Um, basically, if we think about um, particularly yoga as a practice, the idea of doing it well, right? Of you know um, perfection in practice, right? So we don't just do yoga, or we we strive to do it well, right? It's the path from imperfection to perfection. Um, so when we think of yoga, um, not just as uh, a practice or a philosophy or as a science, if we think of it as a skill or technique that needs to be developed, that needs to be perfected, right? A skill or technique that involves certain principles and certain methods, right? And finally, that it's an activity, right? There's action involved. Then we can think of yoga itself as an art, right? Well, what about art then? So, in the same, following the same sort of development, right? Um, we can think of art as a practice. Right? This is an image, one of the most famous paintings in the history of Western art, right? Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. Um, and it depicts a painter, right? Painting. Um, but it also depicts sort of the very act of observation. This painting was singled out by the theorist Michel Foucault as being emblematic of basically a whole way of thinking, right? Particularly the transition from uh, in the West a classical way of thinking to a modern way of thinking. But there's all kinds of things going on in this image. We see a mirror, what appears to be a mirror in the background with the king and the queen observing the scene. Um, but without doing any kind of analysis, this painting uh, depicts the practice of art, but also the philosophy behind the practice. The word art comes from Latin, right? Um, and ars, right? And ars can refer to either a work of art, a practical skill, or even a business or a craft, right? Um, for its part, the word comes from Sanskrit, riti, which means manner or mode, like a way of doing something. And in Greek, there's the word, I don't know how to pronounce this, artisan, which means to prepare. Um, uh, but our idea of art that we have today actually has more to do with the Greek term techne, right? Which of course is the root for the word technique or technology, right? And the word techne in Greek refers to more what we would call art today, craft, skill, or technique, as I already mentioned. Um, but in general, when we talk about art, we are speaking of either the production or expression of beauty, right? We are referring to what we call aesthetic objects or aesthetic works, right? And I'll get into aesthetics in a second. And we can also be referring to particular fields or genres or categories of art, right? So traditionally, we have what's called the seven fine arts, right? There used to be six, but the seventh came along with technology. Art and technology have always sort of gone hand in hand. Um, uh, in addition to art and knowledge, of course, art and philosophy. But these are the uh, traditional seven fine arts, right? Architecture, sculpture, painting, literature, music, drama, and finally film. Film was only possible with um, the evolution of uh, photography uh, and the moving image at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Um, so we discussed art as a practice. We can also think of art in terms of philosophy, if not as a philosophy per se. Um, Here we have another famous sculpture, this time by, I believe he's French, if I'm not mistaken, but if he's Belgian, I apologize to anyone who may be offended by the mistake. Um, but it's very famous, The Thinker. Um, Although the date is wrong, I apologize. Did not edit this slide properly. Um, so uh, I'm sure you all can Google when it was made. But Rodin, a very famous sculptor, The Thinker. Um, and so when we think of art in terms of philosophy, we get into what's called aesthetics. Right? As aesthetics is sort of the philosophy of art, or the thinking the thinking of art, right? The word aesthetics comes from Greek also, and it's related to sense perception, sensory perception, right? Um, but the what is aesthetics, right? Aesthetics on the one hand is a study of beauty or of taste, right? Taste in this case means like um, appreciation, right? Evaluation. Um, uh, we can think of aesthetics as the philosophy of art or as the set of artistic principles that either guide in the creation of art or the appreciation of art. Um, and a very important Western philosopher for the development of aesthetics was Immanuel Kant, right? He's from the so-called Enlightenment period. Before the Romantic period, we're looking at 18th century in Europe. And he wrote several important philosophical treatises, but one was the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment. And Kant's idea of aesthetics, or in this case, aesthetic judgment, is centered on sort of these main ideas, right? And what he means by aesthetic judgment in this case is, again, aesthetic appreciation, like how to appreciate art or um, evaluate art, how to receive art, but it also reflects how to produce art also indirectly. But his main premise is that art, aesthetics, right? Art is related to pleasure and delight. Right? Um, uh, it's something that gives pleasure, right, or delight. Um, because it's something that gives pleasure and delight. The idea here is that art should basically serve no other purpose than that, right? So he had this idea that of disinterest, or that the judgment or appreciation of art should be disinterested. Disinterested in the sense of um, not necessarily having any utility value in the common sense of the word utility. Like so, art is not necessarily to decorate anything or you know to make money or art is not to be judged by any utilitarian value. Um, that's what he means by disinterestedness. Um, Also, you know, particularly with the appreciation of art, the idea is that this is something that is at the same time subjective and universal. So we can, if we use reason, if we use rationality, right, we can appreciate art based on sort of our subjective experience of the artwork, but also because it's founded on rational principles that this kind of judgment or appreciation uh, can also be either universal or universalized, right? And his final idea is that art should be purposive, not have a purpose per se, but purposive. And that purpose goes back to the first idea of giving pleasure and delight, right? So, um, in other words, for Kant, and we'll talk about this later, Kant developed aesthetics, and then from aesthetics we get the idea of art for art's sake, by the way. So the idea is that, art does not have to serve any other interest than its own, right? And its own would be uh, creating pleasure and delight. He also, to sum up, to finish, to conclude about Kant, he also um, theorized what he termed the beautiful, right? So that's an essential part of aesthetics is conceptualizing beauty, right? And beauty for Kant, or the beautiful, is related to what's sensible, right? Because remember, the word aesthetic has to do with sense, or sense perception, sensory perception. So uh, the beautiful is related to the sensible and also related to form, right? But he also theorized another concept, which is called the sublime. And the sublime is something that is basically uh, beyond the senses and beyond form, right? So one way to think of beyond in this case is super sensible. So um, or we can think of formless, but not formless sense of like a blob or something like that, but something that's so beyond uh, you know what we conceive as form that we can't it can't be measured, right? It can't be fully grasped. Um, so a good example would be like of sublime would be like certain forces of nature, right? Or like objects of nature. So like if you go to um, a natural monument or something, it's so vast, it's so awesome, it's so amazing that you look at it, but you can't really grasp it because it's beyond your ability to grasp, right? So the sublime is related to that, like a storm, or the ocean, things that are you can see it, it's there, but at the same time you can't. It goes beyond our capacity to grasp. Um, so moving along, then, so we've discussed art as a philosophy. Um, we can also consider art as a science, in part because of how we defined science earlier in general terms. But now I want to bring into discussion an Indian philosopher, Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, and he developed a concept which is in a way very related to Kant's idea of aesthetics, but it also moves art sort of away from the uh, Western philosophy and into Eastern philosophy, particularly the philosophy of yoga. So he developed a term, aesthetic science, to sort of describe what it is that art does, and how art can be related to uh, spirituality, and specifically yoga, right? And I selected a few quotes from some of his works that sort of explain how he sees aesthetic science. So I'll begin with this one. There are subjects that are not expressed in normal language. Subtler feelings are expressed through the most subtle modes of expression. Suppose I saw some particular thing for a certain length of time and enjoyed it. The feeling behind such enjoyment, the idea, the reason why I liked it, all these, when expressed through sweet, subtle language, are what is called aesthetic science. So he's very clearly talking about how artistic expression, right? It could be, poetry, it could be through literature, or it could be through art. Um, and he's basically describing in this case, the creation of of um, of art as a form of expression, right? But it's a form of expression related to enjoyment, right? Uh, and another example, suppose you want to convey to others the intrinsic beauty of all things that gives delight to everyone. You may arrange those things artistically, or you may not only arrange them, but also convey them to others in a very sweet and lucid language. Yet finally, you need not even achieve this objective through exquisite language. The message can also be driven home with the help of brush or pen. This is what is known as aesthetic science. So again, we see some similar themes, right, that we saw with Kant's aesthetics, right? The idea of beauty um, and uh, sense perception, delight, right? Joy. Um, and so here, Sarkar is basically thinking of artistic expression, artistic creation in terms of a science, right? Um, and again, it's all about pleasure. It's all about joy, and it's not only about um, giving joy, right? But or receiving joy. It's about giving and receiving joy. Let's be clear. So the person who creates art uh, receives joy and also gives joy. The person who receives the art, who sees the art, reads the art, whatever, is also, receiving joy. It's all about pleasure and it's all about joy. Um, and one difference between Sarkar's view of aesthetic science, and the Western view, at least up until a certain period, is the social perspective. So uh, up until this point, aesthetics has mostly been a subjective affair, maybe even an individual affair, even if shared, right? But Sarkar includes um, the importance of social consciousness, right, and struggle against injustice. So, part of the joy in Sarkar's aesthetics is launching a struggle against injustice, right? Um, and he says social consciousness is indispensable for aesthetic science. So, this is something that Sarkar is adding to a sort of more a general idea of aesthetics, and particularly distinguishes his aesthetics from uh, Western aesthetics. So to sum up, aesthetic science is related to joy, pleasure, and delight. Not unlike Kant's aesthetics, right? Has everything to do with beauty, artistic and poetic expression, sensory perception, which Sarkar refers to as inferences, and finally, social consciousness, which distinguishes this aesthetics from Western aesthetics for the most part. Now, what about yoga and art? How can art be seen as a form of yoga? Sarkar also uh, discusses this, which is to no surprise since Sarkar is also known as Sri Sri Anandamurti, uh, a, a spiritual guru. And he basically developed a concept called supraesthetic science, which is the sort of uh, continuation, we could say, natural continuation of aesthetic science, right? So basically, the idea is that there comes a point um, through through art, the development of art, the appreciation of art, creation of art. There comes a point where this joy, this pleasure, this delight um, becomes so intense, so profound that we basically lose ourselves in it, right? Uh, yeah, we lose ourselves. So just to go through a few quotes also, this continuous progress from the crude to the subtle, from the subtle to the subtlest aspects of life comes within the scope of aesthetic science. And in this process of movement, ultimately, we reach a state in which our refined tastes, refined feelings, and refined expressions transport us into the realm of eternal beauty. So now we are we are moving, right? We're moving away from aesthetics and we're moving into supra aesthetics, and not just temporary uh, beauty, temporal beauty, but eternal beauty, right? Those who attain such a state will no longer possess the ability or capacity to taste the beauty of anything, because at that time they will have attained a state so intoxicated with joy that they will lose their limited identity and thus their ability to experience anything. This exalted state, beyond even aesthetic science, is called supra-aesthetic science. So supra-aesthetic science is is precisely that. uh, the joy, the enjoyment, the delight, the pleasure becomes, uh, at least ideally, infinite, right? And infinite pleasure or joy is called bliss, right? And he associates this bliss with merger in the supreme consciousness, supreme entity. And that is what he calls supraesthetic science, right? So going back to the origin of the term yoga, yoga means unification. So in this case, this is supraesthetic science is unification, is this unification of the individual with the universal. In this case, through um, through aesthetics, particularly supra aesthetic science. Um, and he basically one last difference between Sarkar and Kant. Kant is sort of very philosophical and somewhat very metaphysical too. Um, Sarkar attributes this entire process also in scientific terms, which it's a little bit difficult to understand, but as a way to explain, for instance, our attraction for certain things. Why do we like certain things, or why do we appreciate certain things when we get into art? What makes us like, uh, you know, a particular artwork, or what makes us identify with it, or what makes us feel moved by it? And he attributes it all to vibrations, right? Psychic waves, mind waves, thought waves. Um, so um, one one last reason we can think of this all as a science is if we think about it in terms of in more scientific terms, in terms of vibrations, right? So um, for the more scientific minded in the room, aesthetic science implies that psychic waves coming in contact with vibrations of greater frequency attain a greater wavelength. When the vibrations of happiness become straightened, it leads to anandam, which is bliss, right? Happiness is transformed into bliss. When this undulating movement is directed towards anandam and the waves get straightened, it falls within the scope and jurisdiction of aesthetic science. When the waves become totally free from curvature, when they become fully and finally straightened, this falls within the scope of supra-aesthetic science. One attains the state of anandam, bliss, the highest state of human existence. So this is a more technical explanation of what's going on in our minds when we are faced with art, right? And this movement, I guess, from art and from beauty uh, to uh, what is beyond art, and it's somewhat related to the idea of the sublime. Actually, there's we can definitely compare and also contrast this idea of um, eternal beauty or the super aesthetic uh, super aesthetics, right? With the sublime. So just to sum up, then, super aesthetic science is related to ecstatic bliss, which is again beyond just temporal or temporary pleasure, delight, or um, joy, right? Eternal beauty, super sensory perception or inferences. In this case, divine attraction, right? Um, attraction to the, uh, I hear someone there. Um, attraction to the cosmic consciousness, to um, the greatest of the great, we can say. Merger with the supreme consciousness, finally. Um, so I will pause now. We've completed one third of our talk today, and since we're talking about the art of yoga and particularly the yoga of art, we're speaking in more theoretical terms, right? But what about the practice of art? In other words, like coming back to our sort of everyday, regular lives. Um, what do we do now, right? What are the aims of art when we start thinking of art in these terms? Uh, as a practice, as a philosophy, as a science, and particularly as a form of yoga. How do we see the aims of art? So uh, we we have prepared um, some breakout rooms. Um,
Actually, we are all back in the main room now.
Oh, that was quick. Okay.
we're going to talk a little bit about the aims of art now. When we I mentioned that when we think of aesthetics, right, particularly in the West, um, we have the figure of Kant and the idea that particularly since the 18th century, right, that art should sort of exist apart, right? That art is sort of its own category, that it should serve no other purpose than itself, right? Which is, of course, related to beauty and pleasure and delight and all that. Um, but it should not be sort of judged by moral standards or social standards, conventional standards, etc. And certainly should not be either created or appreciated based on its any kind of utilitarian value, right? So in its most extreme form, this leads to an idea which is became very popular in the 19th century called art for art's sake. When we get into the 20th century, particularly with the avant-gardes, like we see in this image here, um, this idea would be challenged, right? This separation between art and the artistic and the social, right? Um, but there still remains like in the idea of art, particularly in the West, this sort of privileged space for art, even elitist at times, um, as like I said, as its own space, um, and sort of not necessarily uh, related to there it is. Um, Related to the social, it always is, but not necessarily committed to the social, right? Sarkar's view of art and aesthetics is very different from that. On the one hand, he um, sort of dialogues well with the idea of art itself, like ideas of aesthetics, but at the same time, he really includes two things: the social consciousness and the um, this idea of art being uh, a form of yoga, let's just say, to simplify the way we've been talking about it so far. Um, this is an image of the logo for the organization that Sarkar uh, uh, began, right? Founded, Ananda Marga. Um, and I choose this again in part because it's a work of art in itself, right? It's similar to the yantra that I showed earlier. Every element has a sort of philosophical significance. It also has a certain aesthetic appeal. But basically, the motto of Ananda Marga translates to self-realization and welfare of the universe. That's one way of translating it, and it's very much this idea um, that is part of a yoga organization, right? That is the idea behind Sarkar's view of uh, not just art, but the aims of art. So, in other words, in the same way that we can see art and yoga as analogous, not the same, but analogous, we can see sort of analogies between, you know, like spirituality uh, and art, at least from the perspective of Sarkar, right? So, um, I'm going to share a couple of quotes from a discourse that he gave called "The Practice of Art and Literature," in which he basically defines what would be the aims of art, right? And he begins by speaking of literature, which is one of the arts, right? And he says that literature can basically be in Sanskrit, or this sahitya, uh, can be defined in two ways, right? One way is the way that we normally think of literature, right? The portrait of real life, an external expression of the internal workings of the mind, a bold and a powerful expression of the suppressed sides of the human heart, right? Um, this is how we normally see literature, right? Written expression, um, expressions of the heart. Um, and this is where the self part comes in, right? When I was using that previous definition, um, self-realization. um, self-expression in this case, of course. But here he adds something. Literature must maintain a rhythm that reflects the dynamic currents of a society. So even this idea of literature must have some kind of social awareness, some kind of ties to the society. Um, Another definition, though, which of the same term in Sanskrit, um, sort of helps us conceptualize a little better how he sees um, the aims of art. And this is the idea that art, or in this case, literature, cannot, that it has to do with welfare, right? Um, and not just individual welfare, but social welfare. So the word in Sanskrit itself um, is made up, the word literature is made up of the same root for the word welfare, right? So in this way, Sarkar, despite a lot of the similarities between these Sarkar's aesthetic science and uh, Kant's aesthetics, which would, of course, be the um, sort of the foundation for Western aesthetics in general, modern aesthetics. He challenges the idea of art for art's sake, right? And says that this is not the aim of art. Um, the aim of art would be for him art for service and blessedness, right? Um, because art or literature, in this case, sahitya, um, it moves with society, right, and leads society towards true fulfillment and welfare, right? Um, so not art for art's sake, but art for service and blessedness. And in this case, it's important to recall that the word blessedness is related to the word bliss, right? Um, so we see the connection between his aesthetic science and his idea of um, the practice of art in literature, or the aims of art. Um, so, but we have the same idea, the artistic movement towards welfare, both individual and social. Both the attainment and the bestowal of happiness find simultaneous expression. The aim of all artistic creation is to impart joy and bliss. Right? So this would be then the aim of art, which is again related to the aesthetic science and aesthetics in general, right? Joy and bliss, right? Both giving and receiving joy and bliss, and also moving with, in this case, this is something that Sarkar's adding, um, collectively, right? Not just individually, but collectively. Um, and a very inspiring idea of where does the artist fit into all of this? The artist's ideal is to be established in transcendentality beyond the bounds of the sensory world, right? So artists, or more precisely, worshippers of fine art, have to be spiritual aspirants if they want to move in the right direction. Only those who look upon all worldly things from a spiritual perspective can realize in everything the blissful transcendental entity. The greater the realization of this transcendental entity, the greater the understanding of one's oneness with that entity, and thus the greater one's success in the creation of art. So here we see again how art and spirituality uh, can be seen and are seen uh, uh, as essentially related, right? Uh, the art, artists must be like spiritual aspirants, or must be spiritual aspirants in a way, in order to properly um, uh, create art, or make use of um, their aesthetic practice, we could say. Um, and um, this idea from
Mark,
Sarkar,
I'm sorry, Marcus.
yes,
I just want to give you a time check that our time is over. It's 10:04.
really?
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. Well, can I
So
just
I just,
can I end with these
yes,
two slides?
yes.
Okay. So I apologize, but so this idea might seem particular, but it's actually much more universal than we may grant, right? So we basically find throughout history, ancient times, modern times, contemporary times, artists saying the same thing in different ways, right? So I decided to separate uh, two artists that are saying the same thing in different words, basically. One, I just discovered this pianist recently. She's amazing. I highly recommend searching for her on YouTube. Um, but just listening to her music, you can feel uh, all of this that we've been discussing. And then I found this quote by her, which I wanted to share. For me personally, art is a gate to a more spiritual life. It is a language which is sensitive to nuances, ambiguity, and things placed somewhere in between. I think life is full of these subtleties, and usually in our busy life in the 21st century, we just can't notice them because of lack of focus and omnipresent stress. Therefore, in my opinion, an artist's task is to stay focused and open to life and living. I also believe that a more spiritual life means more connection and compassion that we need in order to be fulfilled, and art is a teacher on how to find that. Art is truth as well. It should show what is heroic, but also what is ugly. So going further, an artist should be a truth seeker. So without going into more, without analyzing this further, we can easily see affinities and with what Sarkar had been discussing about the aim of the artist. And you know what? I think I forgot to share the audio, but the second example is by a Russian filmmaker, very famous, Tarkovsky. And I have a video by him.
Андрей, cos'è l'arte?
Короче говоря, мне кажется, что для того, чтобы строить любую концепцию, в частности, взгляд на искусство, следует прежде всего ответить на другой вопрос, гораздо более важный и общий. Вообще, зачем человек живет? В чем смысл человеческого существования? Использовать наше пребывание здесь, на Земле, для того, чтобы духовно возвыситься. Это означает, что искусство должно наше служить, так сказать, для этого. Если, скажем, я избрал другой принцип и смысл жизни для себя, очевидно, и искусство для меня выглядело бы в другом смысле, и я бы должен был изобрести что-то другое. Но в силу того, что я свой смысл существования человеческого определяю именно таким образом, мне кажется, что и искусство должно человеку помогать развиваться в этом направлении. То есть, короче говоря, искусство служит для того, чтобы помочь людям духовно измениться, вырасти. Не знаю, была такая точка зрения, что искусство таким же образом познавательно, как и вся остальная человеческая интеллектуальная и духовная деятельность на планете. Я вообще не слишком верю в возможность познания. Я почти агностик. Знание нас все более и более отвлекает от главной цели, от главной мысли по поводу нашего знания о мире. То есть чем больше мы знаем, тем меньше мы знаем о нем, потому что мы углубляемся и тем самым лишаемся возможности глядеть широко на то, что мы называем жизнью и миром. Искусство служит человеку для того, чтобы помочь ему, так сказать, духовно воспарить, возвыситься над самим собой, используя то, что мы называем свободой воли.
Since there were subtitles and beautiful images, so again we see certain ideas here that resonate or align with what Sarkar was referring to about not only about the aims of art, but also aesthetic science, right? I'd like to highlight in this video particularly the idea of this progress, right, from the the crude to the subtle, being established in sort of some kind of transcendence, right? Not everything, of course, aligns, but what I'm trying to show is that these ideas that we've been discussing here, and we will close with this thought, are present in art, in artists all around the world, in all ages, in all cultures, in some form or other. To find it, we only need to be attuned, and basically, we have to be able to see it, be able to hear it, be able to perceive it, right? So I think we can stop there. We must stop there actually. So um, I appreciate your patience, and I apologize for the length. And I believe we probably have some time for some questions, from some dialogue. I'll
People,
stop sharing.
thank you so much, Marco. We will we sometimes stay after a little bit, and people, if they want to ask questions, some people need to go right away. But also, if you send Reese the link for that video, there was a request for it. When we send out the recording, we can also send out the link for that video so people can hear it if they want. So,
Okay, I saw it on Instagram by accident, and I downloaded it. So
and
uh,
I also want to put a big thank out to our translators who were in breakout groups behind the scenes, guiding people through the captions.
I have a question for you, Marcos.
yeah,
So
Marcos.
I'm curious about I don't know, some, pieces of art that were used like to show like wartime or some terrible experience, that as a way to what open people's minds or to understand better what was going on. What is your viewpoint on using art in that way?
I think any art that tries to raise awareness, awareness can mean different things, of course, but in this case, social awareness is uh is is good, right? Uh, you may be referring to an artwork like Guernica, right? So
Yes, that's exactly what I
uh,
was thinking of.
yeah. So I mean, uh, that's a great example actually, because Picasso was a formalist, right? So he was primarily working with form. And in working with form, was trying to like basically not only himself see the world differently, but also share with others different ways of looking at the world and objects, and but also tapping into sort of uh, more more primal or primordial sort of consciousness. But in the case of Guernica, for instance, he was using that what would have been a primarily aesthetic exercise, right? Like he does with many of his other pieces, for instance, like a guitar or a woman or whatever. In this case, he was using that same uh, technique, right? The Cubist technique, and applying it to a social cause, right? So um, it's kind of um, allowing us to perceive war differently in a way, but also in a way that can probably affect us differently, because all of these artwork has a sort of a psychic or psychological impact on us, right? So a lot of it is subliminal, to talk about the sublime, but we don't really realize a lot of times like how art is affecting us mentally when we see it. Like so like when we see something like Guernica, right? It's not just the topic itself, but it's the form that's really imprinting on our minds, like this messaging on a whole other level, right? So um, I think that's sort of a great use of art. At the same time, I don't think it needs to be the only use of art. So um, I think it's important for artists to have social consciousness, to for social consciousness awareness, to be present in artwork. But you know, at the same time, there's nothing wrong with just doing a guitar, right? Portraying a guitar. Um, but I think the problem is when there's a complete absence of social awareness, right? We see that a lot, especially in fine arts circles. Like people sort of live in a bubble. Um, you know, there there's a lot of lack of social awareness, which is why Sarkar criticizes the art for art's sake. Let's think about this. One thing I always try to note, I guess, in these contexts is that, particularly when Sarkar contrasts art for service and blessedness versus art for art's sake, I think it is important to note that he doesn't declassify art. Like, without getting into what is art per se, it's important to, I guess, attribute to art that which it is, and which we normally ascribe to art, right? So first of all, it must be art, and then we have to think about how what the aims of that art can be, right? Um, uh, just because there's a social message doesn't make it art, right? And just because there's not a social message doesn't make it not good art or whatever. What do you think?
Well, as you said, you could do something with the guitar just to show that you can portray it in a different format, and that changes the viewer's perspective. So that can be an amazing experience right there. Anything that moves your perspective can also open your mind. So there's different ways to approach that.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
I like that really. Like the
Hmm.
idea that it changes our minds, right? It makes our minds more sensitive and more sensible also. So um,
Right, like
that's it.
oh, go ahead.
No, no, go ahead.
Well, sometimes I hear people say they don't understand modern art. They don't like things to not look like what they are. But really, in not looking like what they are, it changes your vision and your angle and the way of perceiving things.
Yeah, that's a great comment too. I think part of the and I was one of those people, right? A long time ago, I could say, and part of it has to deal with education, right? About learning. So interestingly enough, and we'll keep the Cubist example. What Picasso thought he was doing actually was actually um, realism. Like in other words, like he's really trying to get down to like what is the reality of objects? The reality of what we see is all related to basically lines, curves, and you know cubes, spheres, etc. Like so. In other words, cubism as an art, the idea was to help us really perceive the actual forms of reality, right? Which we tend to just generally blur, right? We don't pay so much attention to form, right? And form in its most basic uh, elements, right? So, uh, uh, the cubists considered themselves realists, right? They're really getting down to what reality is. Um, but it was so different than the art that had been done until then that people rejected it outright. They thought it was ugly. And part of this was actually cultural stereotypes and prejudice because Cubism was based on African art. Uh, so, a lot of the backlash against Cubism at first was, because the European mindset couldn't accept, different or other perspectives, right?
Oh, that's
And we still have
fascinating.
that today.
Yeah.
We still have
Yeah.
that today. A lot of the rejection of art comes
Mhm.
from a lack of understanding, in my opinion, a lack of understanding. Um, it doesn't help that art, for art's sake, has created a bubble and it doesn't dialogue with the rest of society. That's why Sarkar says, art has to move along with society. So when you have a small group of people moving a little too fast or a little too off in some other direction, they're not doing a very good job at dialoguing with people. But at the same time, people also need to sort of go along, right?
Right. And so that's why it's important for artists of all kinds to, in some way, explain what they're doing, right? I mean, the art can stand alone, it's true, but I think artists need to dialogue a little more.
I agree, and they need to be a little bit less self-centered.
Hmm.
Um, but if they don't do it, that's where the teachers come in. Uh, you know,
Hmm.
like um, yeah, that's where teachers need to come in and sort of mediate, right? Like say, no, 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 like this is what Cubism is doing, right? They're
Hmm.
like that helped me a lot actually. Like that's why I said it has to do with education. Like I only learned to appreciate modern art and even contemporary art uh, through studying, trying to understand what they're doing, and then evaluating whether I thought it was good or not. But um, it takes some work on the viewer's part or the reader's part to understand also. Like the artist is working, but also the public needs to work also a little bit.
We just want to again thank everyone for joining us here on the Neohumanist Education Exchange. We will have another event next month, so please check that out on our website at nhca.gurukuhl.edu. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your Saturday, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You. And thank you for bringing in Tarkovsky. He's an amazing filmmaker.
Yeah,